Coming tonight. Appreciate you being here. And it's a pleasure to introduce Liz Teston this evening. I'm excited to have her presenting as a faculty member in the School of Interior Architecture. It's a great time. And in 1995, Liz started her formal education in design at SCAD, where she earned a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Interior Design in the year 2000. Then she spent 10 years as a professional in commercial design in Atlanta, including the offices of Perkins & Will. 2013, she earned a Master's of Architecture from Georgia Tech. And that same year here at UT, we were doing a national search for a tenure-track faculty member, and we're certainly happy that she joined the faculty. Liz has since generated a list of accolades and accomplishments that include the 2016 Best Paper Award at EDRA, the 2017 Women in Build Women of the Year in Design Education, the 2017 James Johnson Dudley Faculty Scholar, and she just returned from Bucharest, Romania, where she served her Fulbright Award. So these are some amazing accomplishments that we've seen her complete. Liz will be discussing her research and scholarship in a 3-chapter rated stream this evening of public interiority, memory, and the everyday. She is interested in how the interior can redefine preconceived limits and expand the potential for diverse and inclusionary practices. The scholarship investigations include work from Knoxville and Bucharest. And publications leading to this presentation include her article in Manu Small Urbanism titled, "And Through She Be Little, She's Fierce, the Transit Micro-Urbanism of Protest Architecture." And she has forthcoming articles in the International Journal of Architecture and Spatial Design and the Parallel Territories Toward a New Reciprocity, Integrating Material, Design, and Technology. And in the same journal, but in the parallel spatial issue, Reclaim the City, Urban Regeneration Through Interior Intervention. She's also authored chapters in edited volumes. She's authored Functional Obsolescence, Repurposing Our Futures in Interior Futures, Public Interiority and Urban Experience, Independent from Architectural Interiors, in Interior Inferior in Theory, and Transient Interior Spaces of Gender and Bucharest Street Culture in the Interior Urbanism Reader. And finally, Protests, Transient Interiorities in Temporal Passageways and Transient Spaces. So her work is certainly reshaping and shaping design perspectives. Ideas, interior space, and protest politics are synthesized with perspectives from different walks of life, allied disciplines, and acknowledges the importance of the everyday ritual. What I also super appreciate about what Liz is doing here is that over the past 5 years is watching her commitment to teaching of scholarship of interiority in the design studio. She uses her timely and thoughtful investigations with students to help them develop imaginative and critical skills in a manner that supports their personal and professional growth. So please welcome Liz Teston.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Well, I'll wait to do that. Thanks, David, for the introduction. It's an honor to be a part of this lecture series. I also want to say thank you to the Lecture and Exhibits Committee for creating such a great series this year. I'd also like to thank my colleagues and those who have supported me along the way and acknowledge my former research assistants like Ali Bosarge, Aaron Collins, Geneva Frank, Colleen O'Leary, Pruitt Smith, and Abby Green Stewart. And thanks to everybody in the crowd too. It's good to see so many familiar faces in attendance right before final reviews. Excuse me. I appreciate all of you for coming out tonight. Developing this lecture gave me the opportunity to reflect on my past experiences and see how these things shape my design perspective. So as a kind of prologue to my recent work, I'll begin by giving you some details about where I've been, And then rather than giving you an exhaustive overview of everything that I'm currently involved in, I'm going to share the story of my work with you in 3 chapters, giving you the most recent chapter first. These chapters include my recent Fulbright to Romania, research-driven speculations on the politics of design, and memory in everyday places, all of this connected through the overall structure of interiority. And now for the prologue. Previous to my time here at UT, I was a designer in Atlanta, and for a decade I designed corporate offices and law firms. On the surface, this experience is different from my current teaching and creative practice, but during this time I cultivated relationships with many clients and other designers, and at a certain level it's not so different from what we do here today. My current work explores the intersection between public interiority, memory, and the everyday. This is the focus of my recent Fulbright grant to Romania and my work as the current Dudley Faculty Scholar for the college. I view interiority as a perceived condition rather than a place. Interiority can be found inside structures, but also outside and in the public sphere. I'm especially interested in this last condition that I often call public interiority or transient interiority. Teasing out these subtleties reminds us that at its core, design is about revealing, reshaping, and improving everyday settings for everyday people. Designers are good at seeing potential and proposing provocative alternatives within mundane frameworks. In my current work, I reframe these concepts through analytical drawing and writing. I try to rethink the disciplinary limits and infuse interior architecture with diverse and inclusionary practices. I explore these themes as both a scholar and a designer, allowing each pursuit to feed and enrich the other. The purpose of my scholarship is to serve as a basis for design actions. I mine existing real-world conditions, and I'm interested in our varied and collective perceptions of place and how these perceptions can increase advocacy for human-centered design. Design can be inclusive and human-centered in 3 broad ways. It includes the perspectives of people from all walks of life. It aims to incorporate views from allied disciplines, and it acknowledges mundane, everyday contexts. I'm involved in several different pursuits to expand the role of interiority in everyday public places beyond architecture. Such work focuses on the up-close and personal nature of inclusive design and will continue well into the future. This approach represents a shift of conventional models that typically elevate the formal and material aspects of design. As an early entry into these concepts, there was my twofold contribution to A Guide to the Dirty South, Atlanta, edited by Jennifer Bonner and now available in a second edition through Ashgate. My contributions, Rap City and A Conversation with Goody Mob, question the relationship of architecture to cultural identity, collective memory, and the everyday. Jennifer Bonner speculates that architectural theory, like hip-hop, is a geographically shaped phenomenon. We can, therefore, have a contemporary architectural theory and hip-hop music that's uniquely Southern. My research in particular analyzed hip-hop lyrics in Southwest Atlanta vernacular architecture to understand Atlanta's cultural identity. From this analysis, I advanced theories and design interventions about Southern identity and architecture that equally respected authenticity, the mundane, and the eccentric. In her review of the book, Rachel Reese, a writer for Burnaway, observed that the guide navigates a journey of the off-beaten path into a lived city, and that the star of this guide is the pink and red toned section titled Conversations, particularly the interview between Teston and Big Gib, the member of the hip-hop group Goody Mob. Because it's the little things that bring us together, and memory and the everyday form the core of our early creative practice. Sorry, guys. This simple acknowledgement recognizes the power of inclusion and agency in design. Frequently overlooked people and places like the Dirty South or senior citizens offer valuable contributions to design practice. Good design should be accessible to people from all walks of life. A big part of my teaching and research efforts have been spent supporting forgotten groups by revealing these perspectives. So at first glance, this collection of my recent work appears to be made up of a loose collection of projects and explorations. But take a closer look and you'll see it's all connected and that the narrative begins with these prior experiences. Braided streams like memory and the everyday and public interiority are all part of a greater related network within the same channel. Within the public interiority stream, I'll discuss my Fulbright grant, the Dudley work, and my publications in the Interior Architecture Theory Reader, Manu, Transient Spaces, and the Interior Urbanism Reader. This will be the bulk of our conversation tonight. A useful starting point for understanding my perspective on public interiority is the essay Politicizing the Interior, which Routledge published as part of the Interior Architecture Theory Reader. In this essay, which was also awarded the Best Paper Award at EDRA, I speculate that the boundary of interior architecture should be considered a liminal space. The outer edge of the discipline is not stiff or opaque. It's porous and includes a variety of perforations that both enrich and augment the discipline. This disciplinary frontier has thickness that slightly overlaps other disciplines like cultural geography, architecture, anthropology. Interior architecture should reappropriate experiential observation methods from these disciplines to emphasize the phenomenological and inclusive design. I examined the role of politics in interior architecture through an analysis of cultural theory. In this case, when using the word politics, I'm talking about in terms of the polis, or a society characterized by a sense of community, place, or a group. By acknowledging the blurred edge between the territories of interiority and urbanity, we see that the interior is made up of both experiential and political settings. A frontier is the outer limits or boundary of a territory or a discipline. It could easily be misconstrued as a defined edge, but the truth is that this frontier has thickness. A hard edge between disciplines is imaginary. Designing interior spaces often relies on existing conditions within existing buildings, but interiors are also contingent upon the surrounding urban context. Designing interiors that focuses primarily on aesthetics and materiality feeds a disciplinary boundary fantasy. It ignores the larger political context. And likewise, urban scale design, articulated with this sole focus on political and geometric forces, ignores experience and supports the illusion of a disciplinary edge. Each discipline should make use of the broader frontiers of its neighbors. In the same way that the situationists critique society and urbanity, we should critique interiority's established structures. My research on protest encampments is another example of a project that investigates spatial political forces and public transient interiorities. Suspending the prevailing notion that an interior must be the air-conditioned zone inside a building, I explored protest encampments in Minneapolis, New York, Istanbul, and the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. This work addresses an important topic for social justice in design by using research as advocacy. I studied form and experience through two dialectic frameworks, this parasitic independent and transitory long-standing. In other words, some of the encampments were urban conditions attached to existing structures and were somewhat short-lived, like the Black Lives Matter protest in Minneapolis. Other camps were independent from an urban condition, but long-lasting, like the Dakota Access Pipeline protest at Standing Rock. Demonstrations and protests questioned the role of trained designers through provisional encampments. In the Dakota Access Pipeline camps, the organizational structure and contextual relationships generated this semi-public interior condition. DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, is an intensely contested 1,172-mile-long pipeline running from North Dakota to Illinois. Despite widespread opposition, the federal government ordered its construction in February of 2017. The pipeline travels through historic Sioux lands, including the waterways of the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. As a response to the pipeline construction, protesters established 5 different encampments. Oseti-Sakowin was the largest and occupied from April of 2016 until February 2017. The organizational structure of these camps mimicked everyday urban life. Topography initially influenced Oseti-Sakowin's morphology, and later social and temporal conditions formed the camp. Over time, the encampment saw internal, physical, and operational changes and adopted new social dynamics. Neighborhoods were designated based on groups of people with shared needs. A gradation of public and private conditions drove their long-term placement. As winter approached, organizers encouraged protesters to move their tents closer together, and communal resources were redistributed with this new density. The sense of interiority increased as the spaces between the tents contracted in the chilly air. This narrowing created a constellation of open-air rooms. Protesters intermingled and planned their next move. Natural phenomena generated this experiential interiority. Using Sean Lawley's description of material energies or architecture shaped by energy, Oseti-Sakowin's new thermal and acoustic energies surfaced in the winter climate, creating a transient interior condition. We can imagine how the snowbanks created an acoustic enclosure through sound dampening. Provisional architectural conditions define protest encampments like Oseti-Sakowin. The ephemera of lived experience and the passage of time shape interiority more than any tangible architecture. Architecture is immaterial. The character of the environment defines enclosure. The site context and time shaped this space. My contribution to Manu's small urbanism issue, titled "And Though She Be But Little, She Is Fierce," reflected the Black Lives Matter protest in Minneapolis and a real-time breakdown of the micro-urbanisms found in a Confederate memorial rally in Knoxville. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines urbanism as the way of life characteristic of cities and towns, and defines small as operating on limited scale. Through these terms, we can claim that temporary protest encampments are micro-urbanisms. The clustered tents and barricades and canopies form a jostling, overlapping group of amateur improvisational structures. They operate on a limited scale with limited means. Micro-urbanisms are so fleeting that they are almost non-existent, but they by no means have a minor impact on our cities. These short-lived encampments drive our social politics. The micro-urbanisms of protest architecture are provisional. While supported by architectural form, they do not rely on architectural limitations. They, like the activists, are small but fierce. On November 15, 2015, Minneapolis police shot and killed Jamar Clark. Shortly thereafter, the Black Lives Matter activists established an encampment at the 4th Precinct Police Station, remaining there for 18 days. This protest camp was situated at the very site of the authority which the movement rejected. Tents clutched onto a police station facade. Protesters created temporary enclosures. The tents and the urban experience were ephemeral. The compactness of this micro-urbanism promoted solidarity and a conditional interiority. The warped police station facade defined the the encampment. The fourth boundary, or to use Jeff Manaw's term, the close, was mobile and imaginary. It was a threshold invisible to the naked eye. At the sidewalk, heat lamps and campfires generated a temperate imaginary plane. The heat membrane separated the protest encampment from its inhospitable surroundings, an edge only understood through the haptic senses. At other times, the imaginary heated plane infiltrated and expanded. The plane swelled to become a spongy interstitial zone. The zone was a constellation of tents, borrowed banquet chairs, firewood barricades, and bound together by the haze of campfire smoke and makeshift interiorities. The micro-urbanism was manifested through direct human interaction. Later, the fourth boundary withdrew into the night. It became a thin synthetic membrane separating the night air from the tent interior. As I wrote this contribution to Manu, a rally in support of a Confederate Civil War memorial was underway just a few blocks from this building. A helicopter was flying overhead, and local news outlets were reporting updates on the small group of Confederate activists and the crowd of counter-protesters that amassed at the memorial site and in Crouch Park. Like the Black Lives Matter protest in Minneapolis, the Knoxville rally also produced a transient micro-urbanism. Rather than positioning the protest at the site of authority, this rally was situated at a small memorial. In this case, there were no existing building facades to cling to. The activists, counter-protesters, and barricades were all gathered around an obelisk. This micro-urbanism is so small that the spaces and thresholds created by the Knoxville rally were blurred. The spatial boundaries were formed via breaking news updates, helicopters, and blockades of police. The edges of this protest space existed simultaneously in multiple realms. This protest space, while operating on a limited scale and fleeting, dwarfed the memorial and was packed with meaning greater than its physical area. Cities are both places of stasis and ephemera. In this case, the setting with the least physical impact is a street corner obelisk in the fort. The more impactful spatial zone was delineated by protesters, media, and the helicopters overhead. Protest encampments are multivalent architectural conditions. These settings are contingent upon time and the blurring of the interior-exterior threshold. This non-passive condition is a specific form made up of operations and interactions. These temporary constructions and temporal interventions are amateur and improvisational. The protesters and counter-protesters advocate for their own values through the manipulation of public space. They jointly act as agents in the radical reshaping of urban space. Creative works which focus on these types of transient spaces are critical to our understanding of the vast diversity of interiors. Our discipline benefits from seeing interiors through these varied situations because they reveal the bond between the human condition and the urban built environment. In 2017, I received 2 awards, the Fulbright Scholar Teaching and Research Award in Bucharest and the James Johnson Dudley Faculty Scholar Award. I taught at Jan Mincu University of Architecture and Urbanism and lived in Bucharest from January through July of this year. Teaching at Jan Mincu with 150 students enrolled in my cultural identity class was an entirely new experience. I was grateful for the opportunity to develop a dialogue with Romanian design students about my research interests. For the Fulbright grant, I also researched the impact of political forces and the cultural identity of Romanian design. I analyzed these forces by making images that reveal otherwise invisible sensorial enclosures. The positive and timely convergence of these awards enabled me to develop an integrated approach for both the Fulbright in Bucharest and the Dudley work here in Knoxville. I focused my analysis on experiences and the way the urban environment shapes experience. In this way, I bring the interior to the city. An exterior public place can exhibit conditions of interiority. As Walter Benjamin points out in the Arcades project, the flaneur is man uprooted. The crowd is his element. The crowd as a veil through which the familiar city appears transformed. The city as a landscape and a room. This frames interiority as situational and a psychological condition, not an indoor space. In Berlin at the Interior Inferior in Theory conference and in its forthcoming edited volume, I talked about public interiority as a part of larger ideas in our discipline. Carola Ebert's provocation questioned the standing of theory in the interior architecture discipline. She says, taking theory building to be one of the most important acts of defining a discipline and given interior design status as an emerging discipline, the conference title refers to the notion that interior design lacks a historically grown body of research and theory of its own. Good academic research broadens a body of knowledge. While we should acknowledge things that have come before, quality research should also go beyond reframing worn arguments. New modes of thought bestow disciplinary legitimacy because that means our discipline has matured enough to begin to question its own boundaries. For me, that means challenging the conception of the interior. It's common to think of interiors only as components of buildings, but I disagree with the widespread perspective that we should literally work in building interiors only. I see interiority as spaces concerned with humanity, interior, exterior, or otherwise. Innovative design research perforates the physical boundary of the building envelope. It focuses on the human experience, including those in an ordinary urban exterior. I confront this notion through my work in Tennessee and in Romania by recording public urban experiences that are independent of architectural interiors. I hope to forge new territory. Often design research covers topics like evidence-based design and ergonomics, but progressive design research is becoming increasingly critical and exploratory. Rather than continually excavating existing research channels, my interest lies in fostering breadth. By widening the scope of our research, we improve our design phenotype. Interiority is a conditional relationship, as architectural historian Christine McCarthy says, does not depend on restrictive architectural definition. Interiority is instead mobile and promiscuous. In my work in Bucharest and in Knoxville, I'm undergoing a multifaceted approach. The first approach originates from Kevin Lynch's form-based elements, a comprehensive survey of covered areas, passages, and thresholds that lend themselves to literal enclosure and interiority. And the second method, using Walter Benjamin's more subjective view, is through recording transient people-to-people interactions in the city. If we are to confound interiority and exteriority, we must be anthropologists, urban planners, artists, philosophers, as well as designers. As Alex Schwetter wrote in his contribution to Interiors Beyond Architecture, no matter his or her medium, every artist creates an interior, a subjective experience inside the minds of an audience. This statement obliterates our normative conception of an interior. From this vantage point, interiority is even more circumstantial than first understood through spatial means. By learning from existing urban spaces, I'm questioning how we as interior designers look at things, how people, for example, interact with each other, excuse me, at the thresholds of Knoxville's Market Square. Do their interactions create a psychological interiority? What is the essence of public interiorities in Bucharest Piața Amzei? Does the street vendor create his own interiority simply by sitting on a ledge and selling radishes? In Knoxville, we observed built forms that were exteriors but felt like interiors. These places could be covered entrances of office buildings or awnings of shops and restaurants, the nooks and crannies of back alleys or perforations of a facade, or pocket parks that create outdoor rooms, or a hill that when given enough altitude becomes a wall. Seasonal tree coverage also creates an interiority. The flows of people at the fountains in Market Square also shape interiority. People flow through the edges of Market Square at different speeds and locations. A parent and child play in the fountain, and their harmony shields them from the outside world. A bench supports and screens during an intimate conversation. These interiors of circumstance are gray zones, independent from architectural interiors. Market Square is this interchangeable sketch of a place, a framework that provides settings for multiple interpretations of space and place. In Bucharest, particularly the streets around Piața Amzei, the interiority rhythm is more of a piecemeal. In comparison with Knoxville, there are mostly residential apartment blocks with ground floor shops. In Knoxville, pedestrians would gravitate to this open area in Market Square, but in Bucharest, pedestrians repeatedly stop at the tiny shops along the narrow sidewalks. These buildings are porous, blurring the interior and the exterior. These perforated facades are active. We can attribute aggressive personalities to some of them as icicles and snowmelt bombard pedestrians in the winter. The buildings are staking their claim on the sidewalk. The focus here is not in the perforated facade, but the dynamic zone that's created when combined with seasonal conditions and human activity. For the forthcoming interior urbanism reader, I analyzed how people-to-people interactions define the relationship between urbanity and interiority. Looking through a gendered lens, I described how proxemics and Bucharest street culture define Western norms. Romanian feminism is a little different from Western feminism because of the previous government's restriction on individual choices, like women's clothing and their workplace roles. So Romanian gendered dress is in general more common because it represents an alliance with individualistic Western values rather than the communal values of the previous socialist government. Most women, regardless of age, status, or activity, even regardless of the type of shoes that they're wearing, wore sheer hosiery that matched their skin tone. Similarly, Richard Sennett described women who wear the burqa in Cairo, claiming it as a kind of interiority, a mobile interior so women can escape the home and venture into the city. I see this hosiery in Romania as kind of a carapace or protective covering that shields the wearer and enables this interior-oriented subjectivity by using it as a sign or a coding system, all occurring within the public realm. Lois Weinthal has written extensively on second skins and third skins in interior environments. This habitable second skin, or in this case the hosiery layer, is not only a conceptual bridge between body and building, but also a personal, mobile form of interiority with interrelated systems of habits, cultures, and signs. Through this, we understand hosiery as a carapace, a second skin, and a personal interior environment. There's also gendered experiences in Bucharest street culture. As a North American, we often walk on the right side of the sidewalk. It's normal to veer to the right when someone approaches to provide others with enough room and respect what Desmond Morris calls the fingertip zone, or the personal space zone that most Western Europeans and North Americans respect. Imagine outstretching your arms to your fingertips. If your neighbor's closer to you than your fingertips, you might feel a little uncomfortable if you're from North America or the West. If you are from Eastern Central Europe and your neighbor is closer to you than your wrists, you might feel uncomfortable. And the Mediterranean, elbows, and so forth. Okay? So back to the sidewalks in Bucharest. In my experience, Romanians would often walk on either side of the sidewalk. They would try to maintain their course as they approach, even when an uninitiated Westerner steps to the right. The action often resulted in annoying Romanians invading the wrist zone, attempting to squeeze between themselves between the Westerner and me, and sometimes going into the adjacent snowbank. So after a near accident with a pedestrian adversary, someone explained to me the difference in Romanian personal space. They also clarified that there's a local awareness of falling icicle locations. South-facing eaves and ornate facades are particularly prone to this. The local desire to avoid frozen projectiles supersedes any right-of-way. These cases of pedestrian etiquette link personal experience and gender and the everyday to the urban environment. Also in Bucharest, there's a gap in the city grid and an open market at Piața Amzei. Here, people are more reliant on temporal conditions to generate public interiority. The vendor in the red tent sells the Hungarian dessert, kurtokalac, a constant regardless of temperature. But when it's warm, others appear. A Roma woman takes over the path at the grocery store entrance. What she sells depends on availability, and today it's tulips. Another woman walks up and down the sidewalk selling women's underwear. And most mornings, a Roma woman looking for scrap metal would walk up and down the sidewalk yelling, "Fiare vecchi, fiare vecchi, fiare vecchi, fiare vecchi." I was so pleased when I figured out what she was saying. These conditions of interiority sprout directly from the asphalt and bypass the building interior. Public interiority is the result of this reciprocal psychological experience between two people or between a person and the urban environment. It's fleeting, circumstantial. Our perception is shaped by ephemeral forces. These short-lived forces can vary greatly depending on context. But the binding characteristic is that they foster intimacy between two people and between a person and their environment. These fleeting conditions can work in conjunction with built forms to generate exterior, urban, public interiorities. In the future, I'll continue to develop these ideas that came out of my experience as a Fulbrighter, and I plan to produce publications, installations, and exhibits based on these experiences. A critical piece that students can take away from my Fulbright experience is that everyday, mundane, existing conditions have a transformative power. I teach students how to see potential in mundane settings and propose new possibilities whenever possible. I focus my courses on this central question that shapes the future of the design discipline. What is the role of design in society, and how can designers shape space for more equitable uses? Going back to our three streams, I'll now talk about the work that best falls into this everyday stream. Within this, I'll mostly show examples of my scholarship of teaching from interior architecture studios. Since 2013, I've taught the fall second year interior architecture studio My research interests in everyday design impact the studio's key learning outcomes. The adaptive interventions issue of II Journal, in that issue I suggest that design can come from even the most mundane areas. By advocating for small interventions in the urban environment, we challenge the status quo and its top-down, developer-driven strategies. Design is embedded in the everyday and has intrinsic value. Studying mundane things shows that everything has value. Everyday objects, underserved populations, and modestly detailed buildings. If design education originates with everyday places, students will begin by understanding that design is for the masses. Interior architecture shapes lives in fundamental ways. The built environment is a part of our collective memory, whether canonical or mundane. Memory and cultural identity are inextricably linked. So that gives ordinary, everyday settings, like a neighborhood recycling center or an immigrant-owned restaurant, a status that's not always initially evident. Because design potential is everywhere, even in small actions, I organize courses with first-hand learning in mind. In 2013, Jennifer Ackerman, Valerie Friedman, and I asked how project sites like mundane parking spaces and phenomenological explorations of mold and water droplets can facilitate a student's ability to develop a conceptual agenda. I also encourage students to use unanticipated design problems like failed 3D prints to their advantage, because sometimes the best ideas come from everyday conditions, outliers, and glitches. A source of great pride in my teaching is helping to cultivate many capable, engaged members of the design community. My 2015 third-year design studio, for example, was associated with the UT Smart Communities Initiative in Cleveland, Tennessee. Students collaborated with the Bradley County Health Department to redesign the health clinic and community services area. Participating in this partnership afforded students the opportunity to reflect on everyday design and the need for design activism in small cities and rural areas. Quality relationships between students, designers, and the community send students the message that we as designers create places that can bring people together. For the Parallel Territories issue of II Journal, Rana Abudaya and I, she's somewhere over there, reflected on the Crossville Tile sponsored Studios At-Risk Youth Center, a project that was on Cumberland Avenue, and we asked how design can support strong cultural experiences. So now going back to my overall body of work, the third and final stream that I'll cover today is on memory. The quotidian elements of our lives shape our memories and our identity. These everyday conditions form both our individual and collective perceptions of the urban environment. Within the memory stream, I'll discuss the Knoxville Oral Histories project and a third-year interior architecture studio that focused on music and memory. In the Knoxville Oral Histories project, I studied the long-demolished market house at Market Square. The void of the demolished market house created over 60 years ago remains a ghost landmark for longtime Knoxville residents. Historically, Market Square and the Market House enabled different groups of people to come together in everyday situations. The Market House burned in 1959 and was later demolished, leaving a void in the center of the city. Our conversations with Knoxville seniors set out to uncover the experience of this unseen condition. The interviews documented the site as it was before, and we photographed it as it is today. In any city, barely visible traces of earlier demolished buildings exist. Longtime residents innately understand the relationship of the current place to that which existed before. As a transplant, one might observe strangely built conditions or underutilized zones in the urban fabric. With time and with understanding of the local context, the role of palimpsest becomes clearer. Newcomers are often surprised to learn that a bulky masonry structure once filled the only open space in downtown Knoxville. Today, only the Market House's bell marks the previous location of the building. Longtime residents carry a collection of memories, collective and individual, that paint a clearer picture of the history of this place. Our participants described the memories of their youth, events which would later be buried by the inhibitions and responsibilities of adulthood. These memories and events carry the bits that make up our essential selves. They form our perception of the built environment. By interviewing seniors about their early memories, we documented an essential aspect of design, memory and personal narrative. You can find the interviews in an online archive at knoxhistories.org. I just recently revisited this project for a forthcoming essay for RISD's Interventions in Adaptive Reuse special issue on narrative. And now I'm concerned with the stories that we tell ourselves about our surroundings. The mind analyzes both new and frequented places in these terms. The corners of our imagination fabricate these phantom buildings and ghost companions. Our memories present themselves as we navigate the city. Through our senses and our memory narratives, we understand the built environment. Although construction and renovation shape new physical spaces, our memories remain. And in this, I see oral histories as an alternative approach to the design process. The city's an artifact. For example, I know that Ken Yates went square dancing on the second floor of the Market House in 1939. That year, he was also confronted by police for public drunkenness. His bootlegger worked the southeast corner of Market and Union Streets. He told this story to me in our interview, and I remember it every time I walk past the Market and Union intersections. This happened decades before I was born, but it's my memory now. These stories of the city have become my reality, my personal interiority, and I see the ghost bootlegger on the corner. Through design and oral history, we can uncover and reveal stories of our built environment. My research on memory and storytelling, as well as my previous design practice, provides a framework for teaching design studios. A firm grasp on the connection between interior architecture, storytelling, and urbanism amplifies the student's ability to design contextually integrated spaces. As a result, my teaching mission consists of two main goals. Firstly, that my students be equipped with the required learning for their professional degree. And secondly, that they develop the capacity to think independently, think critically, and make educated design decisions. The relationship between memory, empathy, and the everyday was explored in the third year interior architecture studio offered in 2016. In a forthcoming book chapter for Interior Futures, I reflect on the studio's proposition and student design proposals. Interior Futures editors Graham Brooker, Harriet Harris, and Kevin Walker speculated that future interiors will be technology mediated and connected in turn with our own mental and social interiorities, emotional, cognitive, and biophysical. So from the vantage point of the year 2065, and while blending a little bit of reality with a little bit of conjecture, I speculate on how design will be mediated by future concerns like millennial seniors, music therapy for dementia, and adaptively reused high-rises. Specifically, students converted an obsolete office tower into a memory care residence for elderly millennials. In this scenario, the need for corporate interiors has disintegrated. After the upheaval of orthodox corporate paradigms, designers have negotiated a new foundation for contemporary design. This evolution integrates both the cultural and technological needs of society. Atlanta's Bank of America Plaza is one of the tallest towers in North America today in 2018. In 2008, the plaza was around 50% leased. Imagine this condition continuing into the future and the tower in disrepair. By 2065, a constellation of open source teleworking consultants provide professional services. Society shuns traditional office settings as relics of an inflexible and patriarchal past. A conscientious, adaptive reuse of the banal office tower delivers a new paradigm. By reappropriating former office spaces for inclusive uses, we subvert the profit-driven establishment. Such reuse nourishes this obsolete tower. It feeds the urban network of interrelated social, political, and human conditions. So now it's the year 2065. Millennials that were born in 95 are 70 years old. They are the largest living generation on a planet whose total population is 10 billion. Back in 2050, an estimated 16 million Americans had Alzheimer's disease. 2/3 of these were women, and as such, the pressure for memory care spaces has increased. In 2065, millennial seniors prefer urban living, and designers must reanimate the city following the fragmentation of corporate real estate. This communal interior offers a desirable alternative to solitary living. The interior of the plaza provides freedom, camaraderie, and protection. A key aspect of this studio was empathy as a pedagogic tool. An appreciation for the human condition is critical in design education because it prepares students for the new paradigms of design practice. We explored the ways that the senses, memory, and identity can facilitate a student's ethical design agenda. In this studio, students examined the relationship between music, memory, and design. They analyzed this through various mnemonic instruments. These exercises prioritize memory and phenomenology over form-based design to encourage empathic design skills. The emphasis of their own memories and the experience of designed places gave students a perspective that allowed them to critically respond to place and culture. This approach is essential for future design practice, which will be more open-sourced and less restricted by disciplinary territories, therefore requiring expertise in areas of design outside of traditional architectural subjects. To conclude, it's essential that we as designers focus our efforts on theories and practices that engage the interior from a place of inclusion. This is possible by acknowledging the importance of memory, narrative, and the everyday within perceived interior conditions. I see this as a starting point for both the design process and design education. These actions can encourage people to think about interiority and its role in our everyday lives and everyday spaces. Some continuing questions might be, what are some alternative forms of representation for this brand of interiority? How can designers, through installations and spatial interventions, reveal interiority to others? Or what would a publication, a kind of DIY or how-to guide look like? This manual would be for people who want to find interiority in their own urban backyards. These are some of the questions that I've been thinking about and will continue to explore into the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. We'll take a few moments for questions. Oh, back here. I'm sorry.
Hi, I apologize if this is a little outside of the scope of the conversation, but I'm really intrigued by that the path of design or interior architecture is to engage with the blurred boundaries between professions. And the way I understand professional history for architecture and landscape architecture is that, like, in the beginning, in the 1800s or whatever, there was no distinct boundary for what a professional did, right? And I think people attribute like specialization. At that point, advance of technology had made professions like very strictly specialized. And so what do you think maybe a force or a geist that's driving or that's blurring those boundaries or making those boundaries disappear? And how does that reflect back into the topic of the lecture?
Yeah. I think that boundary setting in the interior design, interior architecture discipline is something that is talked about a lot in interior design theory and research. And one of the things that I was trying to explore is the idea that we kind of need to get over that and to think more about doing good work and less about whether or not it's supposed to be in our little silo or somebody else's silo, you know? But I think that one of the factors that is encouraging people to start to look at design for interiority in that way is that we're all becoming more specialized in certain regards, and that specialty could be seen as something more about the human condition than a legal discipline. Does that make sense?
Any other questions?
Hey, thanks, Liz. That was a really generous, thoughtful unfurling of the work. Sorry, my voice isn't working very well.
Me too.
Today,
It's all good.
really like thinking about circumstantial interiors and what kind of crossovers it produces for interior architects, other disciplines that have nothing to do with design whatsoever. And I just wonder, what kinds of anecdotes do you have from times when your spatial expertise became relevant to someone who didn't expect it, or that it became, valuable for you to be a spatial expert when someone didn't know they needed that, let's say? Or, it doesn't have to be something specific.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is working with a team of architects and engineers on designing outdoor spaces for office spaces, right? And being able to contribute to that conversation, but also on the same project, me being the person that designs the parking lot layout. So, these, as designers, I think we hop onto different projects with different roles at different times that in reality don't always have a lot to do with what our degree is in.
Any other questions as we move forward here? Thanks.
I wanted to ask, what it says about the interior for you if you're so eager to bring other things into the definition of the interior, but you kind of answered that. So my question is, in going back to the Dirty South project, what role did hip hop play in that project, and what plays that role in the more recent work for you?
Yeah. That work really shaped the things that I explore today. So we were all, there were 14 of us that studied different aspects of the Dirty South, and the one that I chose to look at was hip hop, and in an effort to refamiliarize myself with the lyrics and think about the way artists moved through the city over the course of 20 years, I started to read all the lyrics and map them, and noticed in that work that there was this narrative that was going on. Here. So all of these places up and down Campbellton Road were mentioned as banal as like JJ's Rib Shack or the gas station, a U-Haul that is a laundromat, these strange combinations of entrepreneurial places. And there was this attitude that of the everyday and narrative and the lyrics and this understanding of authenticity in storytelling. Okay. So the next step that I did was to design this monument that is similar to Aldo Rossi's little beach cabin, and me and a group of friends moved it up and down Campbellton Road and photographed it at all of the sites that were in the map, and then designed an imaginary, speculative addition to JJ's Rib Shack. Okay. But the way that that impacted the stuff that I'm doing now is that I realized that Southwest Atlanta is this kind of forgotten area that nobody talks about, nobody goes to, and that there's really important stuff happening there, and there's things that are important to that community, and that it's important to reveal the narratives of forgotten communities. So I began with that oral history project here in Knoxville when I arrived, and as you see, continued on. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Okay. We can keep going if you want.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah. My question, thank you very, very much for stretching everybody's boundaries, I think. And my question is specifically about interiority in the urban condition. Mm-hmm. And if you see it as something that's really three-dimensional, what's the role of scale? Some of your diagrams were sectional, so there was partial closure, but not always. So do you want to say something about three-dimensionality, especially when you're outside, and the role of scale?
Sure. Let me see if I can find this diagram again. I think that you're remembering the ones that are little icons of these different conditions, right? So to begin the analysis work, I was looking at maps and photographs of things that were appearing in the news when they were happening, and realized later that a lot of that work is kind of top down, and it like an aerial view, and you need to start to represent it in section because it's really a sectional based issue. How is the building in form-based interiorities covering or hugging you or not? Or are there different types of interiorities that can be created by banquet chairs in Minneapolis or balloons or trees and things like that? So it can be, when form-based, it can be very much a sectional property because it's your understanding of how much your coverage there is. But when it's more of an ephemeral thing, I think that that is understood in like haptic senses mostly. Imagine heat, snowbanks.
Thanks. Any other questions tonight?
Okay.
Liz, I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'm just sort of interested, if that's okay. Make this the final one.
Okay.
You know, particularly around memory and sort of the nature of the interiority of urban spaces and the way we've been thinking about politics and social media, and even when we were talking a little bit beforehand, do you have any thoughts about how digital communications and mediums may start to influence the way we think about these spaces and the way that we interact within our in our urban environment?
So like I was saying to Marlene, I began a lot of that research by looking at things that are online and not actually going to these protests. So there's something kind of funny about creating a representation of a space that you haven't been to, you know, in an interesting way. And also, just before the lecture, David and I were talking about the changing workplace and how, you know, people don't work in offices all the time, they telework, and that change will also happen at the university level. So I think increasingly our sense of place will be rooted in things that we can't see. I'm not sure I'm hoping that these experiences that we have, and if we design places that are more focused on experience, that'll help ameliorate that. But in particular, like Marc Augé's non-place, and all of these non-places are like airports and supermarkets and other places such as that create these conditions that are detached from the area that you're in. That can also occur with technology-mediated place, right?
Thank you.
Okay. All right, thanks for sticking with it, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.